The millionaire in crisis gets help from his gardener, and what he discovers changes his life. Do you want to know how this incredible story ends? Stick around until the end. You'll be amazed. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our exciting stories. Maxwell Rothschild stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, staring at the manicured gardens 40 stories below without really seeing them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn, but all he could focus on was the growing darkness in his own mind. His fingers trembled as he lifted the crystal tumbler to his lips, the aged Scotch doing little to calm his nerves. The email from the board was still open on his computer screen behind him, its words burning into his consciousness. Emergency meeting called to discuss leadership concerns, recent erratic behavior, company stability at risk. 20 years of building Goldcrest Enterprises from the ground up, and now it was all threatening to crumble because he couldn't keep himself together. Maxwell's reflection in the glass showed a man he barely recognized anymore. At 45, his once sharp features had grown haggard, dark circles underlining eyes that had lost their fierce determination. His perfectly tailored suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost in recent months, or the slight tremor in his hands that seemed to worsen with each passing day. A knock at his office door made him flinch, spilling drops of scotch onto his Italian leather shoes. "What?" he barked, not turning around. "Mr. Rothschild?" His assistant's voice was hesitant. "The landscaping team is here for your approval on the new garden design." "They're waiting in the conference room." Maxwell closed his eyes, fighting back a wave of irritation. The garden redesign, another project he'd initiated during one of his increasingly frequent sleepless nights. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." After his assistant's footsteps faded, Maxwell walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, a small orange prescription bottle rattled accusingly. Anti-anxiety medication he'd been prescribed but hadn't touched. Taking them felt like admitting defeat, and Maxwell Rothschild didn't admit defeat. He slammed the drawer shut and straightened his tie instead. The conference room was bright and sterile, its white walls decorated with architectural drawings of the company's various properties. 3 men in business suits stood as Maxwell entered, but his attention was drawn to the 4th person, an older man in worn work clothes who remained seated, weathered hands folded calmly on the glass table. "Mr. Rothschild," one of the suited men began, "we've prepared several concepts for the garden redesign. As requested, we've focused on creating a more contemplative space." "Who are you?" Maxwell interrupted, his eyes fixed on the older man. The seated man met his gaze steadily. "Miguel Ramirez, sir. I'm the head gardener. Have been for 15 years. Maxwell frowned. He'd owned the building for 12 years and had never noticed this man. "Why are you here?" "Because, Mr. Rothschild," Miguel replied with a quiet dignity that made Maxwell's imperious tone seem childish. "Gardens aren't built on paper, they're grown from understanding the soul of a place and the souls of the people who will walk there." Something in Miguel's calm demeanor and assured words made Maxwell pause. The man's deep brown eyes held no trace of the fear or sycophantic respect he was used to seeing. Instead, they seemed to look right through his carefully constructed facade, seeing something Maxwell himself had been avoiding for months. "Everyone out," Maxwell suddenly ordered. "Except you," he pointed at Miguel. "You stay." The suits exchanged uncertain glances, but quickly gathered their presentations and left. As the door closed behind them, Maxwell sank into a chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Tell me about your vision for the garden," he said, surprising himself with the request. Miguel smiled slightly, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It wasn't a professional drawing, but a sketch done in pencil, showing winding paths and quiet corners. "A garden should be a refuge," he began, his accent gentle but clear, "somewhere the soul can breathe. Right now, your garden is like you, Mr. Rothschild. All sharp edges and perfect lines, but no place to rest." Maxwell felt something catch in his throat. "What do you mean, like me?" "I've watched you for years from my gardens," Miguel said simply. "Every morning you arrive earlier than anyone else. Every night you leave last. Your shoes always polished, your suit always perfect. But lately, your shoulders are heavy, your steps drag. The garden sees everything, Mr. Rothschild, and so do those who tend it." Maxwell wanted to be angry at this presumption, this invasion of his privacy. Instead, he felt the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crack. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know that a man doesn't build an empire like this without carrying great weight," Miguel replied. "And I know that even the strongest trees need deep roots and soft earth to grow. Your garden can be more than decoration, Mr. Rothschild. It can be healing." Maxwell stared at the simple sketch, seeing something in its organic lines that spoke to the chaos he felt inside. How long would it take to build? "A few months. To grow?" Miguel smiled again. "That depends on how much you're willing to let it." As Maxwell looked at the old gardener, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the aggressive optimism he projected in board meetings or the calculated confidence he showed to investors, but a quiet, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness that had been consuming him. "Do it," Maxwell said abruptly. "Whatever you think is right, just do it." Miguel folded his sketch carefully and stood. "I'll start tomorrow." "But Mr. Rothschild," he paused at the door. "Gardens grow best when their owners walk in them. 7 in the morning, I'm usually by the old oak tree. The light there, it helps you see things clearly." After Miguel left, Maxwell remained in the conference room, staring at his reflection in the window. For the first time in months, the man looking back at him didn't seem quite so lost. The next morning, Maxwell found himself standing by the old oak tree at 6:55 a.m., feeling oddly self-conscious in his $1,000 suit. The early morning air held a crisp freshness he hadn't experienced in years, having always been sealed away in his office at this hour. The tree's ancient branches stretched overhead, filtering the dawn light into dappled patterns on the grass. "You came," Miguel's voice carried across the lawn, genuine pleasure in his tone. The old gardener was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with tools and seedlings, his work clothes already smudged with earth despite the early hour. "I had an early meeting anyway," Maxwell lied, adjusting his tie unnecessarily. Miguel's knowing smile suggested he saw through the excuse but chose not to comment. Instead, he began unloading his tools with practiced efficiency. "Would you like to help me plant these?" he asked, holding up a tray of small green shoots. Maxwell stared at him as if he'd suggested burning down the building. "I have meetings, important ones. The board meeting isn't until 10, Miguel said casually, continuing his work. "I overheard your assistant confirming it yesterday." A flash of irritation shot through Maxwell. "You make a habit of eavesdropping on my schedule?" "I make a habit of paying attention," Miguel replied, his calm unruffled. "Like I notice you haven't been sleeping. Your hands shake when you think no one's watching, and you've started keeping the blinds closed in your office." Maxwell's irritation turned to anger. "You have no right." "Take off your jacket," Miguel interrupted, holding out a trowel. "These gardenias won't plant themselves." Perhaps it was the absurdity of the situation, or maybe the fact that no one had dared interrupt him in years, but Maxwell found himself removing his jacket. He rolled up his sleeves with precise movements, aware of how out of place he must look. "The earth doesn't care about expensive suits," Miguel said, as if reading his thoughts. "It only cares about honest work and patient hands." For the next hour, Miguel taught Maxwell how to prepare the soil, handle the delicate roots, and create the perfect depth for planting. The work was methodical, requiring focus that pushed away thoughts of board meetings and company crises. Maxwell's hands grew dirty, his perfectly pressed shirt became spotted with soil, and surprisingly, he found he didn't mind. "Every garden has its secrets," Miguel said as they worked, "things buried deep that affect what grows on the surface." He paused, looking at Maxwell with those penetrating eyes. "Like companies, like people." Maxwell's hands stilled in the dirt. "What are you getting at?" "The board meeting today," Miguel said quietly. "They're worried about more than just your recent behavior, aren't they?" Maxwell felt his chest tighten. "How could you possibly know about that?" "The cleaning crew talks. The security guards watch, and I listen." Miguel's voice remained gentle but firm. "They say there are irregularities in the company's charitable foundation, money that can't be accounted for." The morning air suddenly felt cold. Maxwell's hands began to shake again, dirt falling from his fingers. "You don't know what you're talking about." "No." Miguel reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. 3 years ago, your company's foundation launched a program to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. The headlines were impressive. The photo of you shaking hands with the mayor was very nice." He paused. "But my grandson, who was supposed to benefit from that program, he never saw a penny." Maxwell stood abruptly, wiping his hands on his ruined pants. "This conversation is over. Running from the truth doesn't make it disappear," Miguel called after him. "Like weeds, secrets grow stronger in the dark." Maxwell stormed back to his office, barely acknowledging his startled assistant as he passed. His hands trembled as he poured himself a scotch, not caring that it was barely 8 a.m. The foundation, his personal pride and joy, the crown jewel of his philanthropic efforts, had been his way of giving back, of proving he was more than just another ruthless CEO. At least that's what it was supposed to be. He opened his laptop, accessing files he hadn't looked at in months. Numbers scrolled across the screen, each one a damning testament to decisions he'd justified at the time. Small diversions of funds here, administrative costs there, all gradually building into a monster he couldn't control. It had started 3 years ago, when the pressure to maintain Goldcrest's growth had become overwhelming. The foundation's funds provided an easy solution, temporary loans that he'd fully intended to repay. But like quicksand, each movement to free himself only pulled him deeper. The board knew something was wrong. They had to. The emergency meeting wasn't just about his recent behavior, it was about everything he'd been hiding. And if they dug deep enough, his computer chimed with an incoming email. The subject line made his blood run cold. "Foundation Audit Report. Preliminary Findings." Maxwell's fingers hovered over the mouse, fear paralyzing him. Before he could click, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The garden teaches us that growth requires truth. When you're ready to face yours, I'll be by the oak tree. Miguel." Maxwell stared at the message, anger warring with a desperate need for guidance. How had the old gardener known? More importantly, why did he seem to care? Looking out his window, he could see the oak tree in the distance, its branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. Miguel was still there, methodically planting gardenias in the freshly turned earth. Even from 40 stories up, there was something compelling about the simple dignity of the work. The audit report waited on his screen like a ticking bomb. The board meeting loomed 2 hours away, and somewhere in between, Maxwell Rothschild had to decide whether to keep running from his secrets or finally let them see the light of day. His hand shook as he reached for his jacket. Maybe it was time to get his hands dirty again, this time with the truth. Maxwell's shoes left clear imprints in the dewy grass as he made his way back to the oak tree. His Italian leather Oxfords weren't made for this terrain, but then again, nothing about him seemed made for where he found himself now. Miguel looked up from his work, unsurprised by his return, as if he'd known all along that Maxwell would come back. "The board meeting," Maxwell said, his voice hoarse. "It's not just about the foundation, is it? You know more." Miguel straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "Your security chief, Mr. Sullivan? He drinks coffee in the garden every Tuesday morning. Last week he was talking on his phone about forensic accountants, about evidence." The old gardener's eyes held no judgment, only a deep understanding that made Maxwell's chest ache. He mentioned the name Elena Torres. Maxwell felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the oak tree's trunk for support, its rough bark grounding him in reality, even as his world spun out of control. Elena Torres. the one name he'd hoped never to hear again. "You know who she is," Miguel said. It wasn't a question. "She was our foundation's financial director 3 years ago," Maxwell managed, his throat dry. She discovered irregularities in our accounts, asked too many questions, and then she disappeared," Miguel finished quietly. "Resigned suddenly, moved away. At least, that's what the official story says." Maxwell slid down the trunk until he was sitting on the ground, not caring about his suit anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden, but the darkness in his mind was deeper still. "I didn't hurt her," he whispered. "I just made sure she stayed quiet. Paid her off, threatened to destroy her career if she ever spoke up. But now she's speaking," Miguel said, lowering himself to sit beside Maxwell with the careful movements of age. "Isn't she?" Maxwell nodded numbly. "The audit report that just came in. It's filled with details only Elena could know. She's been gathering evidence all this time, building a case." He laughed bitterly. "The board meeting isn't about my behavior or the foundation's irregularities. It's about everything. They're going to expose it all." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands absently pulling at a weed growing near his feet. "When I first came to this country," he finally said, "I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a handful of seeds my grandmother gave me before I left. Seeds of home, she called them. I planted them in every garden I tended, watching them grow in foreign soil." Maxwell listened, somehow knowing this story was important. "One day, the owner of the house where I worked accused me of stealing his wife's jewelry. He had no proof, but he didn't need any. Who would believe a poor immigrant over a wealthy man?" Miguel's voice carried no bitterness, only a deep wisdom. "I could have run, could have found another job, hidden away. Instead, I stayed, faced him, showed him the seeds I'd planted, how they'd grown into flowers his wife loved. Sometimes, Mr. Rothschild, standing your ground and telling the truth is the only way to root yourself in who you really are. The truth will destroy everything I've built," Maxwell protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Miguel corrected gently. "The lies are destroying everything. The truth," he gestured to the freshly planted gardenias, "the truth is like these flowers. It may start small and fragile, but given light and care, it grows into something beautiful." Maxwell's phone buzzed again. A reminder. 30 minutes until the board meeting. He pulled up the audit report, finally opening it. The details were worse than he'd imagined. Elena hadn't just documented the foundation's misused funds. She'd traced every decision, every justification, every step that had led him down this path. "I can't face them," he said, but Miguel was already shaking his head. "You faced the dirt this morning," the gardener reminded him. "Got your hands dirty for the first time in years. How did it feel?" Maxwell remembered the strange peace he'd found in the simple act of planting, of creating something real. It felt honest. "Honesty is like good soil," Miguel said, standing with a slight grunt. "Everything worthwhile grows from it." He offered his hand to Maxwell. "The question is, are you ready to plant yourself in the truth?" Maxwell stared at the offered hand, calloused, dirt-stained, strong, everything his own manicured hands were not. In that moment, he saw his choices clearly. He could run, hide behind lawyers and denials, or he could face what he'd done and accept the consequences. Elena's face flashed in his mind, young, idealistic, determined to do what was right despite the cost. She'd had more courage 3 years ago than he'd shown in his entire life. Maybe it was time to learn from her example. "The board," he said, taking Miguel's hand and standing, "they'll want my resignation. Probably press charges." "Probably," Miguel agreed. "But a garden doesn't die in winter, Mr. Rothschild. It rests, recovers, prepares for new growth." He looked at Maxwell intently. "The question is, what will you grow from this?" Maxwell brushed the dirt from his pants, straightened his tie one last time. "Will you be here? After?" Miguel smiled, turning back to his gardenias. "The garden needs tending, no matter who owns the building. And people?" He gave Maxwell a knowing look. "People need tending too." As Maxwell walked toward the building's entrance, his shoes still leaving prints in the grass, He felt lighter somehow. The truth waiting in the boardroom would change everything, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it. He thought of Elena, of all the people his decisions had hurt, and knew what he had to do. His hand had finally stopped shaking. The boardroom fell into a stunned silence as Maxwell finished speaking. 14 pairs of eyes stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to something that might have been pity. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, tiny things made visible only in the right light, much like the truth he'd just laid bare. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly." Harrison Wells, the head of the board, finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of 3 decades in corporate law. "You're not only admitting to misappropriating funds from the foundation, but also to actively silencing a whistleblower through coercion and threats." Maxwell kept his eyes fixed on the polished mahogany table, where his handwritten confession lay like an open wound. "Yes, Elena Torres attempted to bring these irregularities to light 3 years ago. His voice caught, but he forced himself to continue. "I threatened to destroy her career, her reputation. I paid her a substantial sum to disappear and stay quiet, which she clearly didn't do." Sarah Chen, another board member, interjected. She was reviewing Elena's comprehensive report on her tablet, her expression hardening with each swipe. "This documentation is meticulous. Bank transfers, email correspondence, recorded conversations. She's been building this case for years." "She was always thorough," Maxwell said softly, remembering the young financial director's attention to detail, her unwavering integrity. "It's why I hired her, why I should have listened to her. Instead, you chose to systematically defraud your own charitable foundation," Harrison continued, his tone sharp with disappointment. "The very organization you created to help underprivileged youth. Do you have any idea how many children could have benefited from those funds?" The question hit Maxwell like a physical blow. Miguel's words about his grandson echoed in his mind, one of countless young people who had been denied opportunities because of his actions. 2,743, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The board members exchanged glances. "I'm sorry?" Sarah asked. "That's the exact number of students who qualified for our educational programs over the past 3 years. Maxwell finally looked up, meeting their eyes. "I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing every application, every single one. Names, faces, dreams, all denied because I chose to use the foundation's funds to cover corporate shortfalls and maintain the illusion of continuous growth." He stood, his legs unsteady, but his voice growing stronger. "I'm not here to defend my actions or ask for leniency. I'm here to take responsibility and to try, in whatever way possible, to make this right." Harrison leaned forward, his expression grave. "You understand that we're legally obligated to report this to the authorities. The SEC will be involved. There will likely be criminal charges." "I understand." Maxwell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "This contains my immediate resignation as CEO, a complete confession of my actions, and a personal guarantee to repay every dollar taken from the foundation, with interest." He placed another document on top. "I'm also transferring 30% of my personal shares in Goldcrest to a new trust, specifically designated to fund the educational programs for all previously denied applicants." Sarah picked up the documents, scanning them with practiced eyes. "This is comprehensive. You're essentially surrendering a significant portion of your wealth." "Money that was never mine to begin with," Maxwell corrected. "I built this company promising innovation and integrity. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of both." A knock at the boardroom door interrupted the tense discussion. Maxwell's assistant entered, her face pale. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but she's here." "Who's here?" Harrison asked, but Maxwell already knew. Elena Torres walked into the boardroom exactly as Maxwell remembered her. Tall, composed, with eyes that seemed to see through every corporate facade. 3 years hadn't dimmed the intensity of her gaze or the straight line of her shoulders. She carried a small USB drive in one hand and the weight of truth in the other. "Ms. Torres," Maxwell said, his voice catching, "I was just telling the board everything, though I'm sure your version is far more complete." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "When I sent that audit report this morning, I expected denials, legal threats, the same tactics you used 3 years ago." She placed the USB drive on the table. "I didn't expect a confession. I met someone who taught me about the value of truth," Maxwell said, thinking of Miguel in his garden. "About how secrets are like weeds. The longer you let them grow, the deeper their roots become." "An interesting metaphor from a man who's spent his life in boardrooms," Eleanor observed, taking a seat. "Why now, Maxwell? What changed?" The question hung in the air, heavy with 3 years of silence and shame. Maxwell walked to the window, looking down at the garden where a small figure could be seen working among the newly planted flowers. "This morning I learned that integrity isn't about maintaining a perfect facade," he said slowly. "It's about getting your hands dirty with the truth and working to grow something better from it." He turned back to face them. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can face it, make amends, try to rebuild not what was lost, but something new, something honest." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The students who were denied opportunities, you've reviewed their cases?" "Everyone," Maxwell confirmed. "The new trust will ensure they all receive the education they were promised, with additional compensation for the delay. Including your grandson, Mr. Ramirez," he added, looking at the garden again. Elena followed his gaze to the small figure below. "The gardener," her eyes widened with recognition. "Miguel Ramirez. He's been feeding me information for months, keeping track of your deteriorating mental state, your late-night office visits, the signs that you were cracking under the weight of it all." Maxwell felt a sudden wave of understanding wash over him. Miguel's seemingly omniscient knowledge of the situation, his careful pushing and prodding, it hadn't been just the wisdom of a gardener, but the calculated efforts of someone working with Eleanor to bring the truth to light. "He knew exactly what he was doing this morning," Maxwell said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Getting me to work in the garden, talking about secrets and truth. He was preparing me for this moment. Miguel has always believed that people, like plants, will grow toward the light if given the chance," Elena said. "He saw something in you worth salvaging." Harrison cleared his throat. "As touching as this is, we have serious legal matters to address. Ms. Torres, I assume you're willing to testify about everything you've documented?" "Yes," she said firmly, "but I'd also like to propose something." She pulled out another document from her briefcase. "A structured rehabilitation program for the Foundation, one that includes strict oversight, transparent accounting, and a new board of directors composed of community members and education advocates." "With you as director?" Sarah asked. "With me as part of a team," Eleanor corrected. "One that includes voices from the communities we're supposed to be serving." She looked at Maxwell. "People like Miguel, who understand the real impact of our decisions." Maxwell felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, replaced by a glimmer of possibility. "The Foundation should be independent from Goldcrest," he added, "free from corporate influence or pressure, and he paused, gathering his courage. "I would like to work with it, not as a leader or decision-maker, but as someone who needs to make amends, if you'll have me." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence held something different, not shock or disgust, but the tentative shape of redemption. Through the window, Maxwell could see Miguel starting work on a new flower bed, turning over the soil with patient, steady movements. Even from 40 stories up, there was something profound in the simple act of preparing the ground for new growth. Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of judgment and possibility. "Mr. Rothschild, you'll face criminal charges. There will be fines, possibly jail time. Your reputation in the business world is essentially over." "I know," Maxwell said quietly, "but maybe it's time for something new to grow from these ruins." 18 months later, Maxwell Rothschild knelt in the community garden, his hands deep in the rich soil. The morning sun warmed his back as he carefully planted a row of tomato seedlings, each one a tiny promise of future growth. His prison-issued ankle monitor peeked out from beneath his worn jeans, a constant reminder of the price of truth and of the journey still ahead. "Your technique has improved," Miguel's familiar voice came from behind him. "You no longer treat the plants like they're business contracts to be forced into submission." Maxwell smiled but didn't look up from his work. After serving 6 months in minimum security prison for financial fraud, he'd been released on the condition of community service. Specifically, helping to establish and maintain community gardens in underserved neighborhoods. It was Elena's idea, supported enthusiastically by Miguel, who had become his mentor in more ways than one. "I had a good teacher," Maxwell replied, gently patting the soil around a seedling. "Though I seem to remember someone telling me that gardens teach us what we need to learn, not what we think we need to know." "Ah, you do listen sometimes." Miguel lowered himself onto a nearby bench, his movements a little stiffer than they had been 18 months ago. "The foundation board meeting is today, isn't it?" Maxwell nodded, sitting back on his heels to survey his work. The community garden had transformed what was once an empty lot into a thriving green space. Local families tended their plots, growing food and flowers while their children learned about nature in the small educational center they'd built. It was one of 6 such gardens now operating under the reformed Goldcrest Foundation's new community initiative. "Elena's presenting the annual report," Maxwell said, wiping his brow. 2,000 new students enrolled in educational programs, all fully funded. The scholarship retention rate is at 97%. He smiled slightly. "Your grandson is graduating top of his class next month." "Manuel has always been bright," Miguel said proudly. "He just needed the opportunity to prove it." He paused, studying Maxwell's face. "Will you attend the board meeting?" Maxwell shook his head, turning back to his tomatoes. "That's not my place anymore. I'm just a gardener now." "Just a gardener?" Miguel's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at this garden?" Maxwell looked around thoughtfully. Children were arriving for their morning nature class, their excited voices carrying across the garden as they gathered around their teacher, a former Goldcrest executive who had volunteered to help after the scandal broke. Nearby, an elderly woman carefully tended her herb garden while chatting with a young mother, learning to grow vegetables for the first time. "I see life," Maxwell said slowly. "Connection, growth." He gestured to the thriving plots. "These gardens, they're not just about growing food. They're about growing community, opportunity, hope." He looked down at his dirt-stained hands. "Everything I claimed to be building with the foundation before, but never truly understood. And that," Miguel said firmly, "is exactly why you should be at the meeting. Not as the former CEO, not as someone seeking control, but as someone who has learned the true meaning of growth and service." Before Maxwell could protest, a small commotion at the garden entrance caught their attention. Elena was walking through the gate, dressed for the board meeting, but seemingly in no hurry to get there. Behind her came Sarah Chen and Harrison Wells, both looking oddly out of place in their business attire among the garden plots. "I thought I'd find you here," Elena said, approaching them with a warm smile. "We all wanted to see this place for ourselves before the meeting." Harrison surveyed the garden with obvious amazement. "When Elena proposed converting empty lots into community spaces, I was skeptical. But this," he gestured at the thriving environment around them, "this is remarkable." "It's more than remarkable," Sarah added, watching the children's class in session. "It's exactly what the foundation should have been doing all along, building from the ground up, creating real opportunities for growth." Maxwell stood uncomfortably, acutely aware of his dirty clothes and the ankle monitor. The garden volunteers deserve the credit. The community members, the teachers, the families. "And you," Elena interrupted gently. "Every day, rain or shine, working alongside them. Not because a court ordered you to, but because you chose to stay even after your mandated service hours were completed. "The soil doesn't care about our past mistakes," Maxwell quoted, glancing at Miguel. "It only cares about what we're willing to grow now." "Which is why we're here," Elena said, pulling out a folder. "The board has been discussing the Foundation's future. We want to expand this program. Not just gardens, but comprehensive community centers, places where education, sustainability, and opportunity can grow together." She handed him the folder. "We'd like you to help lead the initiative." Maxwell stared at the proposal in shock. "But my conviction, my reputation, your experience," Harrison corrected, "both in building something from nothing and in learning from failure. The Foundation needs leaders who understand both sides of power, how it can corrupt and how it can transform." "You wouldn't be handling any finances," Sarah added quickly. "That's not negotiable. But your vision, your understanding of what these communities really need, that's invaluable." Maxwell looked at Miguel, who simply smiled and nodded toward the folder. With slightly trembling hands, he opened it and began to read. The proposal was comprehensive. Dozens of new community gardens across the country, each linked to educational programs, job training, and local business initiatives. "This is amazing," he breathed, looking up at Elena. "But why trust me again?" "Because you've proven that change is possible," she said simply. "Every day in this garden you show what redemption really means, not just saying sorry, but working to create something better." Maxwell felt tears threatening and blinked them back. He looked around at the garden again, seeing it with new eyes. The tomatoes he'd just planted, the children learning about photosynthesis, the community members tending their plots. It was all connected, all growing together, just like him. "When do we start?" he asked quietly. "We already have," Miguel said, standing with a knowing smile. "Every seed you've planted, every person you've helped, every truth you've faced, it's all been leading to this moment." He gestured at the thriving garden around them. "Sometimes the biggest changes grow from the smallest beginnings." As the morning sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over the garden, Maxwell felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated purpose. His ankle monitor caught the sunlight, no longer a symbol of shame, but a reminder of how far he'd come and how far he could still go. "The board meeting starts in an hour," Elena said, checking her watch. "Just enough time for you to clean up and join us." She smiled. "That is, if you're ready to grow something new." Maxwell looked down at his dirt-stained hands, then at the garden that had become his sanctuary and school. "I am," he said firmly. "But first, let me finish planting these tomatoes. They need strong roots to grow." As he knelt back down in the soil, Maxwell felt Miguel's approving gaze and Elena's gentle smile. Around him, the garden continued its quiet work of transformation, not just of plants, but of people, of communities, of possibilities. He had lost an empire of glass and steel, but he had gained something far more valuable, a chance to grow something real, something lasting, something true. The morning air filled with the sound of children's laughter, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet hope of new beginnings. Maxwell Rothschild, former CEO turned gardener turned community builder, smiled as he tucked another seedling into the waiting earth. Sometimes he realized you have to lose everything to find what you were meant to grow all along. What would you do if you had the chance to start over and completely transform your life? What do you think was the exact moment the protagonist truly changed? When he got his hands dirty in the garden, or when he finally faced the truth in front of the board of directors? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the deepest conversations arise from stories that make us reflect on our own lives and decisions. If this story made you feel something special, don't hesitate to leave a like and subscribe. Your support helps me keep sharing stories that touch the heart and transform lives. And if you enjoyed this tale of redemption and change, you'll love the one on the left side of your screen. It's just as powerful, keeping you on the edge of your seat with twists you won't see coming, and a finale that will stay with you for days. Don't miss it. I guarantee it'll be time well spent. See you in the next story, where we'll discover together that second chances sometimes come in the most unexpected ways.